What is a dark moment in your country's history that nobody in the country really knows about? There was a rebellion in 1962. The Libertarian Party wanted to overthrow the monarchy and establish a republic. In response, the Sultan declared the country in a state of emergency, turning it from constitutional monarchy to absolute monarchy, granting himself absolute power without having to go through parliament. The revolt failed after a few days, but the Sultan has kept renewing the state of emergency every 2 years to this day, keeping his godlike authoritarian powers. Our school history books just skims over this event, while books detailing the revolt are confiscated by the Internal Security Department. Under the Pinochet regime in Chile, there was Ingrid Olderich, the woman of the dogs. She was a high-ranking member of the DINA Chilean secret police who trained a squad of officers to train dogs, German shepherds, to torture political prisoners. I watched a gritty documentary about it as an indie film festival made by people familiar with the regime, and the most horrifying scene was that of a young socialist protester lady who was arrested and thrown in a jail cell, but did her best to keep her resolve until the door opened and she saw agents with 8 German shepherds on leashes, and her face just fell and she started crying. She knew that she'd spend her next few days being sexually violated, scratched, pissed on, bitten, and more without any mercy at all. In the UK, Theresa May as Home Secretary was pushing for a mass surveillance program and was pushing for the Snoopers Charter Communications Data Bill in 2012 and 2013. Edward Snowden revealed to the world the existence of Tempora in 2013, but had been pilot tested and developed since 2008, becoming fully operational in 2011. This means one of two things. The government developed mass surveillance without the knowledge of citizens, then May tried to get approval for it after the fact. Or the GCHQ made Tempora without the full extent of the government, given the Home Secretary was not aware and advocating for something that already equated, which speaks the power of the GCHQ. I sometimes wonder how much people in my country, Canada, know about WW2 Japanese Canadian concentration camp that occur in Canada. I learn about them by reading a book for my English project in the school. The Holodomor of 1932–1933 was a man-made famine in Ukraine orchestrated by the Soviet regime. Due to harsh collectivization, requisition of grain and other foodstuffs from peasants, and restrictions on movement, millions of Ukrainians died from hunger. This tragic event is considered a genocide of the Ukrainian people, aimed at suppressing national identity and resistance to the authorities. The Holodomor was long hidden in the Soviet Union, but after its collapse, it became widely discussed, and Ukraine recognized it as genocide. The Detroit riot of 1967. Crazy how no one knows about it. German here. I passed this one. Colony Hospital of Barbacena, Brazil. To summarize, it was a psychiatric hospital known as the Brazilian Holocaust. Basically, if you were sent there, it would be similar to going to a death camp. The conditions there were subhuman, shock therapy, being tortured, or just dying from cold and hunger. Best part? 70 of the people there did not have mental disorders and were either prostitutes, homosexuals, political enemies, etc. In addition to this, they trafficked the bodies of those who died there. Most of the massacres and enslaving and stealing of children of First Nations people in Australia. Many just don't seem to care or want to know. During Prohibition, the government funded and lead an operation to release barrels of alcohol that they had poisoned to make people sick and shy away from bootleg liquor. Lots of people ended up dying, but people still drank more than ever. There was this incident in the 80s where an entire psychiatric facility was caught using patients as test subjects for experimental drugs. My mom was a nurse at a nearby hospital and said the whistleblower mysteriously disappeared after reporting it. You won't find much about it online, it's like it never happened. We let James Corden out. How about when Canada's refuge policy in the WW2 years for Jews was none is too many? New Zealander here. We have some truly devastating ones. The three-way handshake of 2011. The Great Marmite Shortage of 2013. The Great Dildo Throwing Incident of 2016. Honatel Gate. It's a miracle our nation survived such dark times. Kia ka'a. In the USA, 2 boys were murdered on train tracks. The investigation into their deaths was odd and weirdly befuddled at concerningly high ranks. Witnesses were killed and medical reports were illegitimate. This was not the work of a gang. On that day, the CIA was protecting a drug trade operation, part of the wider program of using drug money made in trade across Latin America to fund proxy war in Latin America, and Cuba, selling out American lives for a greater good of installing pro-American democracies. An American interest, but not of the American people. I'm Australian. Isn't that enough? The early destruction of electric vehicles. That documentary was depressing. They confiscated perfectly functional electric cars just to destroy them. This was early 2000s. Being one of the last European countries with institutionalized slavery, our own Nazi movement at the beginning of WW2, which gradually transitioned to communism after the country was invaded by USSR. Apparently the sympathizers were so cruel that even Nazi Germans were shocked by their cruelty. In British, there is no shortage of choice. My particular favorite is the absolute mess we, along with France and Russia TBF, made of the peace settlement in the Middle East after the end of the Great War and consequent collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Saudi Arabia is a British invention, and that barely scratches the surface. Imperial arrogance at its absolute finest. Some wag called it the peace to end all peace at the time. Seems almost prescient now. During the Battle of Manila, the Japs refused orders to withdraw and decided to bunker down in Manila and implement a scorched earth tactic. They burned neighborhoods and shot anyone who came out of their homes. They rounded up people into public spaces, churches, schools, and big houses and systematically executed Filipinos. Know an old church? They probably massacred dozens there. It's essentially genocide. Our history books glances over the extent of the WW2 tragedies because it would hurt Japan's feelings. They seriously got irritated when the comfort women issue was brought to light. How much more if we started discussing this genocide in our school textbooks?